Actually, I'm going to bring up Mohawk Chief Tom Porter first, who's going to provide us a blessing of the water. And Chief, I would be remiss if we didn't hear a bit about the drilling process too, so I'll also ask Janice to speak in a few minutes. So, Chief, would you like to say a few words? And Jamie, would you like to come up too and talk about the history of the spring a bit?
Sure. Well, beside being on the committee, I'm also the director of the History Museum. So naturally, history's in my blood. So today I'm dressed as Sir William Johnson, and as for my hobby, I do 18th century reenacting. So when I was asked to talk about the history of the spring, I said we should have Sir William Johnson here because really it all goes back to him. Johnson came here in 1771. He was the agent for the British Crown with the Mohawk Indians and Native Americans, and very, very close with the Mohawks. So this site had been the scene of occupation by the Native Americans for thousands of years. So they brought Johnson here in order to try to heal an old wound. He had a battle wound that he had sustained during the Battle of Lake George in 1755, which was actually a musket ball injury to his thigh. So he was carried in on a litter, and our old history says, well, he drank the water and then he walked back to Johnstown. I don't think it probably happened that way, but the guy did have the gout also. So it's very possible that it may have alleviated some of the pain or the fact that he was carried here. Maybe the swelling went down. But nobody carried me in on a litter today, even though I did ask. And I'm not going to ask to get carried back. But because of Sir William's trip here, he was in the who's who of the 18th century. And word spread about the healing waters near Saratoga, or Schuylerville as it is today, and many people began to come here to settle. No permanent settlers early on, but after General Philip Schuyler brought George Washington here in 1783, it was during his tour of the northern New York battlefields, Washington really talked the place up along with Schuyler. He actually even made a bid to buy this land, however, it was turned down. A few years later, we then receive our first permanent settler of Saratoga Springs, and his name is Alexander Bryan. Bryan's home was right up above us, above the fault line here on what is now Maple Avenue, right across from where the old Bryan Inn now stands. That was actually owned by his son, John Bryan. But as Alexander Bryan's opens an inn and people begin to come there to drink the spring water, and a small town develops here, and it was known as the town at the springs near Saratoga, because Schuylerville was 10 miles away. So as the town grew, tourism to Saratoga Springs grew because people wanted to drink the waters. And somebody put the village on the map, which was John Clark, by bottling Congress spring water just a little bit a ways away from here. His company eventually moves here to High Rock, and they build a round brick pavilion just about where this cone now stands. They bottled water for about 10 years, and then they sold it to two gentlemen, Ainsworth and McCaffrey. These guys built a very large pavilion here. Actually, it was closer to where the folks over here are standing. It was immense. They had a giant golden eagle on the top of the roof. They spent $6,000 on it. They were ridiculed in the Daily Saratogan for spending so much money, and then they went bankrupt. So there's actually a photograph of that right over here behind me in one of the interpretive panels. So another spring water company operated for a few years. They actually had a large bottling plant that was right behind us against the fault line, and they operated up until the early 20th century. The springs were being depleted. Companies were coming in, pumping out copious amounts of spring water, dumping the water, and taking the carbonic gas and selling that for the soda pop industry. It was destroying the aquifers below the city. The state of New York purchased all the lands in the springs and formed the State Reservation Commission, and that's what preserved them. In 1911, they came in here and then they built this pavilion. At that time, however, High Rock Spring was dried up. It is one of the natural springs in the city where the water makes its way through fissures. So as the spring waters changed, that spring dried. So they actually took it and placed it down here on a slab. You couldn't even go down into it as there were rocks, a rock wall right across the front. And it stayed that way, dry, right up until probably the late 1970s or 80s. The area had become High Rock Park in 1968, and then the local spring, the Governor, was tubed over to this. So if you remember water in this, say 20 years ago, that's where it was coming in from, one of the other springs. But it's just sat in the cone. It probably wasn't potable, probably dangerous to drink, so it was shut down. And finally, in 2015, life has come back to High Rock Spring. So 100 years later, history starts all over again with a new spring. So thank you very much for coming. I'm proud to be Sir William Johnson today. And if anybody does want to carry me back to the History Museum, I'm fine with that. Thank you.